Hello learners, welcome to the first lecture in the course MGPE 009 and the first unit, which is an attempt to understand globalization and its ramifications. I'm Dr. Shubhangi Vaidya from the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies at IGNOU. The aims and objectives of this lecture are basically to understand the concept and meaning of globalization and to discuss the genesis of economic globalization and its various dimensions. Globalization is a term that is very commonly used today in the social sciences as well as in our everyday lives. However, we need to attempt to understand its various dimensions in order that we may get a better grasp on the impact of globalization and then attempt to see Gandhi's ideas and vision regarding the impact of globalization and the various correctives that we can think of. Let's look at the concept and the definition of globalization. Globalization has been defined in various different ways, and in its broadest sense, it refers to the way in which societies and cultures and nations all over the world interact with each other, are interconnected with each other, and have a give and take with each other. So therefore, this is a process that has been going on throughout history. However, when we use the term globalization in the contemporary context, we refer to certain specific developments, and that is what we are going to be talking about. So, as mentioned, globalization refers to the tendency towards growing interconnectedness of different parts of the world. It involves an interchange of economic, social, cultural, political, and technological attributes that take place when different societies come in contact with each other. Globalization is also a process, as I have mentioned, that has been going on since times immemorial. However, this specific term globalization became current in the usages of political and social sciences only since the late 1970s and 1980s. The most common definition of present-day globalization refers to the growing integration of various countries into the world economy. It involves the free movement of capital, products, information, and people. The sociologist Anthony Giddens defined globalization as an intensification of worldwide social relations. Therefore, faraway places are linked up to each other and affected by happenings in each other. We see this classic example in the contemporary pandemic. Impacts of the pandemic in one part of the world have had profound impacts on other parts of the world as well. Similarly, economic slowdown, economic crises, all these affect countries which may be very far away geographically, but in terms of their interconnections in the global economy are actually deeply interconnected. According to Meghnad Desai, globalization is the growing reciprocal interdependence of various economies around the world. Kenichi Omae spoke of the borderless world. In other words, globalization implies a world that is no longer constrained by the borders of the traditional nation state. We often use the term the global village. By this we mean that various countries, cultures, and societies in the world are now interconnected in ways that they never were prior to the advent of globalization. We see a mixture of international, multinational, offshore, and global activities involving a progression from the domestic or the local to the global. And as mentioned, geographical boundaries in a sense recede. There is deterritorialization of the world. And of course, driving all of this is the very important role of information and communication and the various technologies of information and communication that have accelerated the process of globalization. What are the features of present-day globalization? How does it differ from the generic globalization that has been taking place in world history since times immemorial? We find that in the post-World War II scenario, there has been a greater market-oriented approach and an internationalization of economic activities, primarily driven by Western nations like the United States and the UK. There has been an adoption of export-oriented development strategies and trade liberalization. We've seen a faster growth in world output and also a huge growth in world trade. Increasingly, greater volumes of exchange of goods and services are being seen, and a greater variety of things are being exchanged. The exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural attributes is also taking place at a much, much faster rate. Technologies such as the internet and mobile telephony make it possible for people around the world to communicate with each other instantly. And this has fostered the growth and development of the knowledge society. Globalization can also be seen in the movement of people. Labor migration is a very, very important aspect of globalization, wherein people move around the world for work. Very often, human rights violations take place in this context. However, we see that the drive to integrate the economies around the world often takes precedence over the human rights of people who are migrating from place to place to drive this global economy. The globalization of policies and policy-making mechanisms of national governments are increasingly dominated by international agencies and big private corporations. These exert a huge influence on domestic policy. And we see this in the growing emphasis in the developing nations on free trade, the shrinking of the social structure, and the restructuring of economies. So this restructuring is basically in response to the impact of international agencies and corporations. And it usually tends towards expanding the free market, expanding trade, and therefore has an impact on governmental role in social sector, in welfare policies. Let's look at the Indian case, for example. In the 1990s, the Indian economy was opened up and it adopted the new economic policy in which the watchwords or the keywords were liberalization, privatization, and globalization. We find that in the 1990s, globalization integrated the Indian economy with the global economy by reducing import and export restrictions, by permitting the free flow of foreign technology and skills, promoting foreign investments, etc. There was a loosening of what used to be called the license permit Raj. In other words, there was much greater freedom for private players to participate in the economy. The privatization of publicly owned companies was also seen, and also, very, very significantly, there was a deregulation of labor protection, resulting in the huge growth of contract labor and subcontracting of labor. What are some of the important economic dimensions of globalization? So as we have seen, this has led to a breakdown of national economic barriers, the spread of international trade, the growing power of transnational corporations and international financial institutions. The policy of liberalization has resulted in the reduction of the state in economic governance, in the withdrawal of the state from some economic sectors and its replacement by the private sector, the decline of the public sector in key industries like banking, insurance, etc., and an overall decline in the state's role in public social services and a much greater reliance on the market. Privatization is a very, very important fallout of globalization. In the 1980s, the UK and the USA advocated privatization of industries and services to make them more competitive and efficient. And we see that the entry of private sector into the public sector, for instance, sectors such as power and telecommunications sectors in India, which were earlier reserved for the public sector, were encouraged in order to make these sectors more competitive, but in fact resulted in a transfer of control over these very, very important public goods into the hands of private players. The contracting out of services and utilities like water supply and so on to private contractors was also seen. The Indian government adopted various measures in the 1990s to privatize the economy. Foreign direct investment and globalization of the financial market is also one of the very, very important consequences or ramifications of economic globalization. We find that international trade regulatory bodies, for instance, like the WTO, play a very, very important role in the global economy. The growth and development of multinational and transnational companies is also a very, very significant impact of economic globalization. For infrastructure development, governments draw funds from private sector and overseas investors, and therefore sectors like power, transport, and communications have been opened up to foreign direct investment. As mentioned earlier, the expansion of ICTs, information and communication technologies, and the birth of the information age is what drives globalization in the contemporary world. The outsourcing of services is also an important consequence. All over the country, we see the proliferation of BPOs, with the business process outsourcing business, in which many, many young people have found livelihoods. However, it comes with its own costs, it comes with its own problems, which we'll not go into in this particular lecture. However, the outsourcing of services is a very, very important fallout of globalization. And the entire economic growth we find is leading to a scenario of jobless growth. And this is something that is not exactly desirable or very sustainable in poor and developing countries like ours. So what was the Gandhian perspective on the way the global economy interpenetrated and influenced the poorer nations? Gandhi's concept of the global village reflects an altogether alternative paradigm of development, in which self-contained and contented villages are still interdependent upon each other and have harmonious relations, and are far away from the exploitative globalization of industrialism, capital, and finance. So given the realities of our country, Gandhi had envisaged a particular pattern of development which placed the self-contained and the independent village at its very center. Gandhi had emphasized that development of modern industrialism requires exploitation of races and places. This is a very, very important observation. We find that the driver of modern industrialization is actually the West, and the West has been exerting its sway upon the poorer nations, upon the more marginalized nations, the former colonies. Gandhi had said, industrialism is, I'm afraid, going to be a curse for mankind. Exploitation of one nation by another nation cannot go for all times. And if the future of industrialism is dark for the West, would it not be darker for India? Gandhi said this in 1931. He further added, in fact, India, when it begins to exploit other nations, as it must if it becomes industrialized, will be a curse for other nations and a menace to the world. In other words, Gandhi was very, very aware of the fundamentally exploitative aspect of industrial capitalism and the fact that industrial expansion and the expansion of the capitalist world order would necessarily lead to exploitation, would necessarily lead to impoverishment of the marginalized and the greater wealth of those who already own the means of production. Gandhi had an alternative framework of science and technology as well. which was essentially a people-centric and problem-solving orientation. Gandhi rejected an uncritical application of big machines where small machines could serve the purpose and also improve the efficiency of labor. He was in favor of technology for need-based production for the masses instead of mass production for competition, marketing, and profits through industrialism. We also see that globalization has seen or has resulted in an expansion of the war industry, of the trade, of the business of arms and armaments, and a competition to acquire war technology has brought the world to the verge of destruction. There is massive malnourishment in large populations who remain unattended. However, billions of dollars are spent on defense and arms. To sum up, we see that economic globalization has been instrumental in creating a world order where there is great interpenetration of capital, finance, and markets. Its basic driver is the capitalist model of development and the growth of systems and interlinkages that strengthen capitalism, privatization, and lead to the retreat of the state from the public sector. This has resulted in adverse impacts on labor rights and also, very importantly, on environment and ecology. Gandhian perspectives on development provide a critical lens through which to view these processes. Thank you.